A 5-year-old girl sits silently in a church on Christmas night, the secret that makes a millionaire regretful. The stained glass windows of St. Michael's Church cast long shadows across the empty pews on Christmas night. In the last row, a small figure sat motionless, 5-year-old Sarah Miller, her thin frame nearly swallowed by an oversized, tattered coat. Her tiny fingers clutched a worn teddy bear, its fur matted and threadbare from years of tears and tight embraces. The bear's button eyes, much like Sarah's, stared unblinkingly at the illuminated altar. Outside, James Anderson's Mercedes pulled into the church parking lot. The millionaire's hands trembled slightly as he switched off the engine. 6 months had passed since that rainy night, yet the memories haunted him still. He hadn't planned to stop here tonight, but something, guilt perhaps, or divine intervention, had drawn him to this place. As he pushed open the heavy wooden doors, neither he nor the little girl knew that their lives were about to intertwine in ways that would shake their world to its core. Sarah's story began not in a hospital, but behind a diner on a cold October morning 3 years ago. That's where Elizabeth Miller, a night shift nurse at Central Hospital, found a crying 2-year-old huddled in a cardboard box. The child wore only thin pajamas, clutching the teddy bear that would become her constant companion. A crumpled note simply read, "Please love her. I can't anymore." Elizabeth, who had spent 15 years helping others bring new life into the world, recognized destiny when she saw it. After months of searching for the child's biological parents yielded no results, she officially adopted Sarah, giving her not just a name but a chance at life. Their tiny apartment above the diner became a haven of love, filled with second-hand toys and the aroma of home-cooked meals. Despite working double shifts to make ends meet, Elizabeth never missed reading Sarah a bedtime story. She taught Sarah to pray each night, kneeling beside her bed in their modest home. "God listens to little angels like you," she would say, smoothing Sarah's unruly dark curls. Together, they attended Mass every Sunday at St. Michael's Church, where Sarah's infectious giggles often broke through the solemn silence. Elizabeth's dedication to her patients matched her devotion as a mother. She worked in the emergency room of Central Hospital, often staying late to comfort families who couldn't afford treatment. Her colleagues admired her unwavering compassion, but hospital administration viewed her tendency to advocate for uninsured patients as troublesome. Sarah flourished under Elizabeth's care, transforming from a withdrawn toddler into a bright, loving child. She inherited her mother's compassionate nature, often sharing her lunch with classmates who had none. At school, her teachers praised her gentle spirit and eagerness to help others. When asked about her family, Sarah would proudly declare, "My mummy found me and chose me. That means she loves me extra special." Their small family included Rachel, Elizabeth's younger sister, who lived across town. Once a promising pediatrician, Rachel's idealism had been crushed by the harsh realities of a healthcare system that prioritized profit over patients. She began self-medicating with prescription drugs, eventually losing her medical license. Despite her struggles, Rachel adored Sarah, bringing her small gifts whenever she was sober enough to visit. Elizabeth dreamed of sending Sarah to college someday. She kept a mason jar labeled Sarah's future in their kitchen, adding whatever spare change she could. "You'll be a doctor too," she would tell Sarah, but one who never forgets to listen with her heart. Each night, as Sarah drifted off to sleep, Elizabeth would whisper the same words, "You're my miracle, my chosen one. God brought us together for a reason." The last photo taken of them together shows Sarah and Elizabeth outside St. Michael's Church last Christmas, both wearing matching red scarves that Elizabeth had knitted. Sarah's smile radiates pure joy as she sits on her mother's lap, the worn teddy bear tucked between them. Neither could have known that 6 months later their world would shatter on a rain-slicked road, leaving Sarah alone with that bear as her only remaining link to the mother who had chosen her out of love. Elizabeth's body was found near the hospital where she worked, victim of what police called a hit-and-run accident. The official report noted that she had been walking home after her shift, having given her bus fare to a homeless patient. Her last act had been one of kindness, a final testament to the way she lived her life. The police investigation stalled quickly, leaving Sarah with questions that no 5-year-old should have to ask. Why didn't the driver stop? Why did God take away the mommy who chose her? And most heartbreaking of all, would anyone ever choose her again? Sarah moved in with her Aunt Rachel, but the woman's apartment felt nothing like the warm home Elizabeth had created. The bedtime stories stopped, replaced by the sound of Rachel's restless pacing and occasional sobs. The mason jar for Sarah's future disappeared, along with the promise of a better tomorrow. Yet Sarah kept her faith, just as Elizabeth had taught her, praying each night beside her bed, asking God to help her find her way back to the love she had lost. James Anderson stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, overlooking the sprawling campus of Anderson Medical Center, his life's masterpiece. At 52, he had built an empire of private hospitals that catered to America's elite, turning healthcare into a luxury brand. Forbes magazine called him the king of boutique medicine, but the crown sat heavy on his graying head. 3 years ago, his world collapsed when his wife Catherine died in a hit-and-run accident. She had been leaving a charity gala, their last conversation a heated argument about his prioritizing profits over patients. The irony wasn't lost on him. She died waiting for an ambulance that took too long to arrive. The driver was never found, leaving James with a void that he filled with expensive whiskey and an even more ruthless approach to business. Catherine had been his moral compass, the one who reminded him of their early days when they dreamed of building hospitals that would serve everyone. As a young doctor, James had worked in free clinics, his wife by his side as a social worker. But somewhere along the way, the idealistic young physician disappeared beneath spreadsheets and profit margins. After Catherine's death, James transformed their mansion into a mausoleum of memories. Her garden withered, her charitable foundation gathered dust, and their shared dream of adopting children died with her. The only thing that grew was his business empire, built on a philosophy that healthcare was a privilege, not a right. His board of directors praised his ruthless efficiency. Under his leadership, Anderson Medical Center became known for its strict policies, no exceptions for late payments, no treatment without insurance verification, no compromise on profit margins. Each decision pushed him further from the man Catherine had loved, but he convinced himself it was necessary for survival in modern healthcare. The ghost of his former self haunted him in quiet moments. It whispered in the voice of his wife whenever he signed orders to deny care to uninsured patients or closed another community clinic to build a premium facility. The whispers grew loudest at Christmas, Catherine's favorite holiday, when she would insist on working in soup kitchens despite their social obligations. His own tragedy had hardened rather than softened him. After the endless nights waiting for news of Catherine's killer, he built walls around his heart as impenetrable as the security systems protecting his hospitals. He donated to political campaigns that opposed universal health care, arguing that quality medical care had to be earned, not given. The parking garage where Catherine died became a premium wing of his flagship hospital, its marble floors and designer furniture a far cry from the free clinic they once dreamed of opening. Each expansion of his empire felt like another betrayal of their shared vision, but James convinced himself that Catherine had been naive. The world didn't reward kindness, it rewarded strength and decisive action. Tonight, his collection of hospitals had posted record profits. The board meeting had been a celebration of numbers that represented denied care wrapped in corporate euphemisms. James had smiled, accepted congratulations, and retreated to his office with a tumbler of 30-year-old scotch, Catherine's picture facing away on his desk. The bitter irony was that his wife's death had made him wealthy beyond imagination. The insurance payout had funded his most aggressive expansion, turning tragedy into profit. Each new acquisition felt like another nail in the coffin of his former self, the idealistic doctor who once believed in healing before billing. Yet behind the carefully crafted image of success, James Anderson was a haunted man. His dreams were filled with Catherine's last words to him, "You've forgotten what it means to be a healer." In quiet moments, he wondered if his empire was built not on business acumen, but on the foundations of a destroyed soul. Soon, a chance encounter with a little girl in a church would force him to confront the man he had become and the devastating role he played in destroying yet another family's happiness. The threads connecting Sarah and James were woven on a rainy night in June, though neither knew it yet. Elizabeth Miller had just finished her final shift at Anderson Medical Center, having been terminated that morning for insubordination. Her crime: admitting a critically ill homeless man without insurance pre-approval, saving his life but violating hospital policy. That night she had emptied her locker, stopping only to leave a detailed letter documenting years of patient care violations she'd witnessed. The letter, sealed and addressed to the State Medical Board, was tucked safely in her worn messenger bag as she walked home in the rain. She couldn't afford a taxi. Her last paycheck would be withheld pending a review of her policy violations. James Anderson left his office late that same night, his vision blurred by scotch and self-pity. It was the anniversary of Catherine's death, and the bitter irony of firing a nurse for showing the same compassion his wife had championed wasn't lost on him. The rain pelted his Mercedes as he sped down the hospital access road, his thoughts a tornado of guilt and justification. He never saw Elizabeth crossing at the intersection. The impact was swift, but what followed was not. James stopped his car, saw her crumpled form in his rearview mirror. For a moment, just a moment, he gripped the steering wheel, ready to turn back. Then fear gripped him. His career, his reputation, his empire, all would crumble if this came to light. He pressed the accelerator, leaving Elizabeth Miller bleeding in the rain, her messenger bag and its damning letters scattered across the wet pavement. The security cameras captured it all, but the footage mysteriously disappeared before police arrived. The only trace was a single frame showing a black Mercedes, evidence quietly buried by hospital security at James's direction. The official report listed the vehicle as unknown, the case quickly growing cold despite being yards from one of the most sophisticated medical facilities in the country. Elizabeth's body was found by the same homeless man she'd saved months earlier. He recognized her immediately and stayed with her until the ambulance arrived, though it was far too late. The cruel twist of fate that she died outside the very hospital that had fired her for showing compassion went unnoticed by everyone except Rachel, who spiraled deeper into addiction after identifying her sister's body. The messenger bag and its contents were never recovered. Hospital maintenance staff, following urgent orders from management, had cleaned the area thoroughly before police arrived. The letter that could have exposed years of negligence and corruption was lost to the storm drains, along with any chance of justice for Elizabeth Miller. In the following months, James buried his guilt beneath layers of rationalization. He doubled the hospital's legal team, tightened security protocols, and donated generously to the police department's benevolent fund. But he couldn't erase the image of Elizabeth's face from the personnel file that crossed his desk during the termination process, the kind eyes, the gentle smile that reminded him so much of Catherine. Now, 6 months later, fate had brought him face to face with Sarah, the orphaned daughter of the woman whose death he had caused. The same compassion he had punished Elizabeth for showing would be the key to his redemption, though the path there would cost him everything he had built. The empire of cold marble and steel, built on denied care and abandoned principles, would crumble beneath the weight of a child's grief and a dead woman's legacy. The tragedy that connected them was about to unravel, thread by terrible thread, in the quiet sanctuary of St. Michael's Church on Christmas night. The night that sealed both their fates, replayed in fragments, like a broken film reel in James Anderson's mind. June 15th, a date that should have been dedicated to mourning Catherine, instead became another night of tragedy. The rain had been relentless, turning Chicago's streets into mirrors that reflected the cold gleam of hospital lights. Elizabeth Miller's last day at Anderson Medical Center had started at dawn. She'd arrived early, as always, taking extra time to say goodbye to her long-term patients. Word of her termination spread quickly through the hospital corridors. Nurses whispered about her final act of defiance, admitting Marcus Thompson, a homeless veteran, having a heart attack without required insurance verification. She had known it would cost her job, but as she later wrote in her final chart note, "I chose my conscience over policy." That evening, she stayed late, methodically documenting every case where hospital policy had resulted in delayed or denied care. Her letter to the medical board was 23 pages long, each page filled with dates, names, and outcomes. In her office, she left a shorter letter for Sarah, tucked inside a children's book, "My dearest angel, always remember that doing the right thing matters more than doing the profitable thing." James Anderson's day had been a blur of board meetings and bourbon. Every year on the anniversary of Catherine's death, he lost himself in work and alcohol, trying to drown out his wife's final disappointed words. The hospital's latest quarterly report showed record profits, but all he could hear was Catherine's voice, "What happened to the man who wanted to heal people?" The security footage, before it vanished, told the story in cold, digital clarity. 11:42 p.m. Elizabeth Miller exits the hospital's main entrance, messenger bag clutched tight against the rain. 11:43 p.m. a black Mercedes S-Class accelerates through the hospital's private access road. 11:44 p.m. impact. The Mercedes stops for exactly 17 seconds before speeding away, leaving Elizabeth broken on the wet asphalt. What the cameras didn't capture was James's internal struggle in those 17 seconds. Through the rain-streaked windshield, he had recognized her from that morning's termination meeting. His hand had reached for the door handle, medical training and basic humanity urging him to help. Then fear took over, fear of scandal, of ruin, of facing what he had become. The cover-up began within minutes. James's first call wasn't to emergency services but to Howard Gates, his head of security. "Clean it up," he ordered, voice steady despite the alcohol and adrenaline. Any footage, any evidence. Make it disappear. His second call was to Judge William Preston, a longtime beneficiary of Anderson Medical Center's political donations. Insurance would be needed for what came next. Hospital maintenance crews arrived before the police, efficiently removing all traces of the accident. The messenger bag with its damning evidence was already lost to the storm drains. When first responders finally reached Elizabeth, she had been lying in the rain for over 30 minutes. The official time of death was recorded as 12:17 a.m., June 16th. The investigation was perfunctory at best. Judge Preston ensured the case landed on the desk of a detective who owed him favors. Security footage from nearby buildings was deemed corrupted by weather. Witness statements from hospital staff were vague and unhelpful, their jobs silently hanging in the balance. Within weeks, Elizabeth Miller became just another unsolved hit-and-run statistic. James buried his guilt in an avalanche of charitable donations and public appearances. The hospital established the Elizabeth Miller Memorial Nursing Scholarship, a cruel irony that made him sick every time he saw the plaque. He doubled his drinking, haunted by the image of her face through the rain-streaked windshield. But Elizabeth's death had set larger forces in motion. Her letter, though lost, wasn't the only record of Anderson Medical Center's transgressions, and in the years she had worked there, Elizabeth Miller had touched many lives, created many allies. But the truth would surface eventually, carried by the very current of compassion and justice that she had died protecting. Life with Aunt Rachel was like living in perpetual twilight, never quite dark enough to sleep, never bright enough to feel awake. The once promising pediatrician's apartment stood in stark contrast to the warm home Elizabeth had created. Empty prescription bottles littered the coffee table, their labels bearing the names of doctors who had once been Rachel's colleagues. Sarah's first night there set the pattern for all that followed. Rachel, overwhelmed by grief and guilt, had forgotten to prepare a bed. The 5-year-old slept on the couch, clutching her teddy bear, while her aunt paced the kitchen until dawn, alternating between sobbing and making frantic phone calls to old medical contacts for prescription refills. The changes in Sarah's life were dramatic and devastating. Gone were the bedtime stories, replaced by the sound of Rachel's violent nightmares echoing through the thin walls. The morning prayers Elizabeth had taught her daughter became whispered pleas in the dark. Please God, make Mummy come back. Please make Aunt Rachel stop crying. Rachel tried in her more lucid moments. She would suddenly remember her medical training, checking Sarah's temperature obsessively, or lecturing about proper hand-washing techniques. But these brief flashes of the accomplished doctor she'd once been would dissolve into paranoid ramblings about hospital conspiracies and corrupt administrators. School became Sarah's only refuge. Her kindergarten teacher, M.S. Thompson, noticed the changes: unwashed clothes, missed meals, the dark circles under her eyes. She started keeping extra snacks in her desk for Sarah and would often let her nap during recess. But when she tried to contact Rachel about her concerns, the calls went unanswered. The mason jar labeled Sarah's future that Elizabeth had kept disappeared, likely traded for pills at one of Rachel's low points. Sarah found shards of it in the dumpster behind their building, along with her mother's nursing awards and family photos Rachel couldn't bear to look at anymore. The apartment became a maze of hazards. Sarah learned to navigate around broken glass and discarded needles, to distinguish between her aunt's good days when she almost resembled the successful doctor in the fading photographs, and the bad days when she wouldn't leave her bedroom. On those days, Sarah would make herself sandwiches from whatever she could reach in the kitchen, carefully avoiding the moldy bread and expired milk. Child Protective Services visited twice, prompted by concerned neighbors who heard Rachel's late-night outbursts. Each time, Rachel managed to pull herself together just long enough to convince them everything was fine. She was, after all, a former pediatrician, her medical knowledge and remnants of professional authority still commanding enough respect to deflect deeper investigation. The only constant in Sarah's new life was her teddy bear, now bearing additional stains from tears shed in secret. She would talk to it at night, recounting memories of her mother, promising they would find each other again. Mummy said if we ever got lost, we should meet at the church, she would whisper to the bear. So we just have to wait there, and she'll come find us. As Christmas approached, Rachel's condition deteriorated rapidly. The anniversary of Elizabeth's death, combined with holiday memories of happier times, sent her into a deeper spiral. She stopped leaving the apartment entirely, having lost her last connection to legitimate prescription sources. Sarah would return from school to find her aunt unconscious on the couch, surrounded by empty bottles and crumpled photos of Elizabeth. The final straw came on Christmas Eve, when Rachel, in a drug-induced haze, mistook Sarah for a young Elizabeth and began screaming at her about abandoned patients and betrayed principles. Terrified, Sarah grabbed her teddy bear and ran into the snowy night, remembering her mother's words about the church being a place of sanctuary. She didn't know she was running toward a confrontation that would change not only her life but the lives of everyone connected to her mother's death. The church's massive oak doors groaned as James Anderson stepped inside, shaking snow from his cashmere coat. The sound echoed through the empty sanctuary, causing Sarah to clutch her teddy bear tighter. For a moment they existed in separate worlds, the millionaire seeking absolution and the orphaned child waiting for a miracle. James noticed her first a small figure in the last pew, illuminated by flickering candlelight. Something about her solitary presence on Christmas night struck a chord deep within him. Perhaps it was the way she sat, perfectly still, like a forgotten ornament after the holiday festivities. Or perhaps it was her coat, clearly second-hand and too thin for winter, that reminded him of his own humble beginnings. "Child, are you alone?" His voice carried across the empty church, softer than his usual boardroom tone. Sarah turned, and James felt his heart stop. He recognized those eyes, Elizabeth Miller's eyes, looking up at him with a mixture of hope and wariness that made his guilt surge like a physical pain. "I'm waiting for my mummy," Sarah replied, her voice barely a whisper. She said if we ever got lost, we should meet here. The simplicity of her faith, the absolute trust in her mother's words, hit James like a physical blow. He knew, with devastating certainty, that Elizabeth Miller would never arrive to claim her waiting child. Moving closer, James noticed Sarah's blue-tinged lips and trembling hands. The church's heating system had been turned down after the evening service, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. Without thinking, he removed his coat and draped it over her shoulders, an act of kindness that felt foreign to his recent nature. "How long have you been waiting?" he asked, sitting down beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. The teddy bear in her arms caught his attention, its worn fur and missing button eye speaking volumes about love and loss. "Since the big hand was on 12, Sarah answered, pointing to the church's ancient clock. 6 hours, James realized with horror. 6 hours this child had sat alone in a cold church on Christmas night, waiting for a mother who would never return because of his actions. Sarah's stomach growled audibly, and James noticed her trying to hide it with embarrassment. "When did you last eat?" he asked, already knowing the answer would haunt him. Her shoulder shrug was eloquent in its resignation, too long for any child on Christmas Day. "Aunt Rachel was sleeping again," she explained, with the matter-of-fact tone children use to describe their normal, even when their normal is anything but. "I didn't want to wake her up. She gets scary when I wake her up." Each word was another weight on James's conscience. This was the ripple effect of his actions, not just Elizabeth's death, but her child's subsequent suffering, the sister's descent into addiction, the complete unraveling of a family he had destroyed with one moment of cowardice. Looking at Sarah now, James saw not just Elizabeth's child, but a reflection of the person he used to be, someone who believed in miracles and waited faithfully for them in churches on Christmas night. Before wealth hardened him, before tragedy turned him cruel, he too had believed in the power of faith and redemption. "Would you like to tell me about your mother?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. As Sarah began to speak, describing Elizabeth's kindness and their simple but love-filled life, James Anderson, the man who had everything and nothing, realized that his path to redemption would begin here, in this moment, with this child whose life he had shattered. What neither of them knew was that this chance encounter would unravel a web of secrets that would change both their lives forever. The truth about Sarah's health emerged 3 days after the Christmas night encounter. James, unable to forget the child in the church, had used his influence to track her down through school records. The discovery that she was living with her Aunt Rachel, once a respected pediatrician at his own hospital, led him to arrange a routine health screening at Anderson Medical Center. Dr. Caroline Wright, the hospital's top pediatric specialist, conducted the examination while James watched through his office's one-way glass. The moment her stethoscope touched Sarah's chest, her professional demeanor shifted subtly. She listened longer than normal, moved the instrument repeatedly, and finally called for an immediate ECG. The results were devastating. Sarah had an undiagnosed congenital heart condition, one that Elizabeth, with her limited resources, had never been able to have properly evaluated. The technical term was complex congenital heart defect with ventricular septal defect and pulmonary stenosis. In simpler terms, Sarah's heart was failing her. Without surgery within the next few months, her condition will continue to deteriorate, Dr. Wright explained in James's office later, while Sarah colored quietly in the waiting room. She's already showing signs of right heart failure. The episodes of fatigue her teachers reported, the bluish tinge to her lips, these aren't just from poor care. Her heart is struggling. The irony crushed James like a physical weight. Elizabeth Miller had died trying to expose the hospital's practice of denying care to those who couldn't afford it. Now her daughter needed exactly the kind of expensive procedure that the hospital routinely denied to uninsured patients. The surgery would cost upwards of $300,000, money that Rachel, in her current state, had no hope of providing. Worse still, as James dug deeper into Sarah's medical history, he discovered that Elizabeth had been trying to get Sarah evaluated at Anderson Medical Center just weeks before her death. The request had been denied due to insurance issues. The denial letter bore James's signature, one of hundreds he blindly signed each month. The next revelation came from Dr. Wright's detailed examination notes. Sarah's condition, if caught earlier, could have been managed with less invasive treatments. The years of delayed care had allowed it to progress to a critical state. Every denial of care, every policy that prioritized profit over patients, had contributed to this child's deteriorating health. James found himself standing in the hospital chapel, staring at the same kind of cross that had watched over his encounter with Sarah in the church. The weight of his choices pressed down on him: the denial of care that might have caught Sarah's condition earlier, the death of her mother that left her in the care of an aunt too broken to notice her declining health, the systematic dismantling of every charitable program Catherine had put in place. Sarah's voice floated through his memory. "Mommy said angels watch over sick children." Elizabeth had told her that, probably on nights when Sarah couldn't breathe properly, when a mother's love had to substitute for proper medical care. Now, looking at the cross, James wondered if any angels were watching over him, recording his sins in some celestial ledger. The hospital's policy was clear: no insurance, no surgery. To make an exception would set a precedent that could undermine the entire system he'd built. His board of directors would never approve it. The legal department would have fits about liability issues. The shareholders would revolt at the suggestion of free care. But as he watched Sarah through his office window, her small figure bent over a coloring book, her lips slightly blue from poor circulation, James Anderson made a decision that would start the unraveling of his carefully constructed empire. He would ensure Sarah got the surgery she needed, even if it meant circumventing his own policies, even if it meant using his personal fortune. What he didn't know then was that this decision would set in motion a chain of events that would expose not only his role in Elizabeth's death, but decades of systematic healthcare inequality. The very system he had built, which had denied care to countless others like Sarah, was about to turn its cold efficiency against its creator. Dr. Wright's final words that day would prove prophetic. "Mr. Anderson, this child's heart is trying to tell us something. The question is, are we finally ready to listen?" As Sarah left the hospital that evening, clutching a new coloring book and wearing a brighter smile, she had no idea that her broken heart would be the key to breaking down the walls of indifference that her mother had died fighting against. That night, after discovering Sarah's condition, James Anderson sat in his darkened office, a glass of untouched scotch on his desk. Catherine's photograph watched him accusingly while Elizabeth Miller's personnel file lay open before him, her final warning letter about patient care still attached. The weight of his decisions, past and present, pressed down on him like a physical force. The security footage of Elizabeth's death had been saved to his private server, his own form of penance. He played it now, frame by frame, torturing himself with each moment. The rain, the impact, those 17 seconds of hesitation that revealed the true measure of his character. In the harsh light of his computer screen, he watched himself drive away, leaving a dying woman in the rain, a woman who had only tried to uphold the principles he had long ago abandoned. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from the hospital board. They had questions about Sarah's unauthorized examination, about the special attention being paid to an uninsured patient. Each message represented the system he had created turning against his attempt at redemption. The same policies he had used to build his empire now stood as barriers to saving one child's life. In his mind, 3 women's faces merged into an accusatory trinity: Catherine, his dead wife who had begged him to remember his calling as a healer; Elizabeth, the nurse who died protecting the values he had forgotten; and Sarah, an innocent child paying the price for adult cruelties. Their combined judgment felt heavier than any corporate boardroom decision he had ever faced. He pulled out his personal files, documents no one else had seen. News clippings about Catherine's death, police reports that went nowhere, his own private investigator's notes that had led to dead ends. The parallels between Catherine's death and Elizabeth's were too painful to ignore. Both women killed by drivers who chose to flee, both deaths marked by institutional indifference to justice. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent 3 years hunting for the person who killed Catherine, while hiding his own guilt as Elizabeth's killer. The same rage he had felt at his wife's unsolved death was what families like Sarah's felt every day when his hospitals denied them care. He had become the very thing he once despised. Opening his desk drawer, James removed a leather-bound journal, Catherine's last gift to him. Inside, she had written, "Remember why you became a doctor, James. It wasn't to build empires." Her words, unread for years, now burned with renewed relevance. The same system that had failed to find Catherine's killer had helped him cover up Elizabeth's death. The same policies that denied Sarah care had probably denied care to countless others. His computer chimed with an email from Dr. Wright, Sarah's detailed treatment plan. The cost was astronomical, but it wasn't the money that concerned him. Authorizing her surgery would mean acknowledging the arbitrary nature of their care policies. If Sarah deserved treatment, didn't every child denied care deserve the same? Where did one draw the line between business and humanity? The bottle of scotch beckoned, promising temporary relief from his moral crisis. Instead, James found himself reaching for his phone, dialing numbers he hadn't used in years. Old colleagues from his free clinic days, lawyers who specialized in medical ethics, investigators who might help him uncover the full scope of his hospital's denied care cases. With each call, the wall between James Anderson, the businessman, and James Anderson, the businessman, began to crack. He thought of Sarah sitting in that church, faithfully waiting for a mother who would never return because of his choices. The same faith that sustained her through loss and illness stood in stark contrast to his own loss of moral compass. Elizabeth had died protecting the values he had abandoned, and now her daughter's life hung in the balance because of the very systems he had put in place. As dawn broke over the Chicago skyline, James Anderson made a decision that would alter not just Sarah's fate, but the fate of his entire healthcare empire. He began drafting a new policy, one that would prioritize care over cost. It would bankrupt him, anger his board, and probably end his career. But as he wrote, he felt lighter than he had in years. The final paragraph of his draft read, "In memory of Catherine Anderson and Elizabeth Miller, whose deaths remind us that every life has value beyond its ability to pay." He knew the board would never approve it. He knew the shareholders would revolt. But for the first time in years, he felt like the doctor Catherine had married, the healer he had once been. What he didn't know was that this decision would set in motion events that would expose not just his role in Elizabeth's death, but decades of systematic healthcare inequality. His attempt at redemption would shake the foundations of everything he had built, and perhaps that was exactly what needed to happen. The following Monday morning, Sarah arrived at Anderson Medical Center for her pre-surgical evaluation, clutching her teddy bear and accompanied by a barely coherent Rachel. James had arranged everything personally, but he wasn't prepared for what happened next, a cruel demonstration of how his own system would resist change. The problems began at reception. Rachel, struggling with withdrawal symptoms, couldn't provide proper documentation. The insurance verification system automatically flagged Sarah's case as non-compliant. Despite James's private arrangements, the hospital's automated protocols kicked in, generating an immediate rejection notice. Linda Matthews, the head of admissions and a 20-year veteran of enforcing Anderson Medical Center's strict policies, intercepted them before they could reach Dr. Wright's office. "I'm sorry, but without proper insurance verification, we cannot proceed with any evaluations," she announced, her voice carrying the practiced neutrality of someone who had denied care countless times before. Rachel, in a moment of clarity fueled by desperation, tried to explain that Mr. Anderson himself had approved the treatment. Linda's response was devastating in its corporate efficiency. "Mr. Anderson's personal interests cannot override hospital policy. That would be preferential treatment." The irony of her words defending rules created by James against James himself was lost on no one except Sarah, who simply held her bear tighter. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Rachel, triggered by the rejection, began a rambling discourse about hospital conspiracies and her sister's death. Her increasingly erratic behavior drew security's attention. Other patients in the waiting room began to stare, some recording the scene on their phones. Sarah, watching her aunt unravel, did something that would later haunt everyone present. She stepped forward, her small voice clear and steady. "My mummy used to work here. She said this hospital was supposed to help people who are sick. Was she lying?" The simplicity of her question cut through the bureaucratic chaos like a scalpel. Linda Matthews, who had personally processed Elizabeth Miller's termination paperwork, recognized Sarah at that moment. The color drained from her face as she realized she was denying care to the daughter of the nurse whose death had been the hospital's darkest secret. Dr. Wright arrived in the middle of this scene. She attempted to intervene, citing medical necessity, but the system James had built was working exactly as designed, efficiently, impersonally, and without exception. The doctor's medical authority counted for nothing against administrative protocol. The final blow came when the hospital's automated system, responding to Rachel's disruptive behavior, generated a 12-month ban on both her and Sarah from all Anderson Medical Center facilities. The document printed automatically, its corporate letterhead bearing the same logo Elizabeth had worn on her nurse's uniform the night she died. James, watching via security cameras from his office, saw his life's work revealed in all its cold inhumanity. The system he'd created wasn't just failing Sarah, it was actively hostile to her very presence. Every protocol, every policy he'd implemented to maximize profit was now working in perfect synchronization to deny care to the very child he was trying to save. Sarah's reaction was what broke him. Unlike her aunt's hysteria or Dr. Wright's professional outrage, the little girl simply sat down on a waiting room chair, held her teddy bear close, and whispered something that the security microphones barely caught. "It's okay, Bear. Mummy said sometimes you have to wait a long time for angels to help." The video of the incident, captured by waiting room patients, would later become viral evidence in the investigation into Anderson Medical Center's practices. But in that moment, it served as a mirror, reflecting back to James the true face of his legacy, a system so perfect in its cruelty that even its creator couldn't override it. Dr. Wright, in a final act of defiance, knelt beside Sarah and whispered, "Don't worry, sweetheart. Some rules are meant to be broken." She then turned to the security cameras and stated clearly, "I am admitting this patient under emergency protocols. Any administrator who interferes will be reported to the state medical board for endangering a life." As security led Rachel away and Dr. Wright took Sarah's hand to guide her to the examination room, James Anderson made a decision. He pulled out Catherine's journal and began to write, "Today I watched my life's work try to kill a child. Whatever happens next, this system has to change, even if it means destroying everything I've built." He didn't know then that this incident would become the cornerstone of multiple investigations, or that the waiting room video would be played before Congress during hearings on healthcare inequality. All he knew was that Sarah's simple question, "Was my mummy lying?" deserved an answer that would honor both Elizabeth's sacrifice and Catherine's memory. The investigation into Elizabeth Miller's death began not in a police station, but in the quiet office of Marcus Thompson, the homeless veteran whose life she had saved on her last day at Anderson Medical Center. Now sober and working as a janitor at St. Michael's Church, Marcus had spent months collecting pieces of a puzzle he didn't fully understand. In a locked drawer in his maintenance closet, he kept a sodden messenger bag, Elizabeth's bag, recovered from a storm drain during his nighttime wanderings. The water had destroyed most of its contents, but a few pages of her letter to the medical board remained legible, preserved between the pages of Sarah's children's book. These fragments hinted at systematic negligence and deliberate policy violations at Anderson Medical Center. Dr. Caroline Wright, troubled by Sarah's case and the hospital's reaction, began her own quiet investigation. She discovered a pattern in Elizabeth's old patient records, dozens of cases where standard protocols had been bypassed to save lives, each followed by disciplinary actions. The final case, Marcus Thompson's emergency admission, had been the last straw for hospital administration. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Linda Matthews, the admissions director, shaken by her encounter with Sarah, began experiencing severe anxiety attacks. During a therapy session, she broke down and revealed her role in cleaning up after Elizabeth's death. Her conscience, dormant for months, had been awakened by Sarah's simple question about her mother's integrity. Working separately but simultaneously, these unlikely investigators began uncovering layers of corruption. Hospital maintenance logs showed cleanup crews dispatched to the accident site before emergency services were called. Security footage from that night had been systematically erased, but backup servers maintained shadow copies as per state regulations. Financial records revealed unusual payments to police pension funds and judicial campaign contributions in the weeks following Elizabeth's death. James Anderson, unaware of these parallel investigations, launched his own inquiry not to cover his tracks, but to understand the full scope of his guilt. He hired private investigators to re-examine both Elizabeth's death and Catherine's similar hit-and-run accident 3 years earlier. The connections they uncovered were disturbing. Both cases had been handled by the same detective. Both investigations mysteriously stalled. Both victims had challenged powerful interests before their deaths. Dr. Wright discovered something else in Sarah's medical records. Elizabeth had suspected her daughter's heart condition months before her death. She had tried repeatedly to get Sarah evaluated at Anderson Medical Center, each request denied due to insurance issues. The final denial letter had been signed the day before Elizabeth died, her termination and death effectively sentencing her daughter to years of untreated illness. Marcus Thompson's contribution proved crucial. Among the salvaged papers was a partial patient list, names of those denied care who later died. Elizabeth had been methodically documenting these cases, building evidence of how profit-driven policies were costing lives. Her letter to the medical board wasn't just a complaint, it was an indictment of an entire system of healthcare inequality. Linda Matthews, seeking redemption, provided access to sealed administrative records. These showed a clear pattern of retaliation against staff who questioned hospital policies. Elizabeth's termination wasn't unique. Dozens of healthcare workers had been silenced through similar means. The system wasn't just cruel, it was deliberately engineered to eliminate dissent. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Rachel, during a lucid moment in rehab, revealed that Elizabeth had called her the night she died. She said she had proof, Rachel recalled. Proof that would change everything. She was going to meet someone, a journalist, I think. She never made it to that meeting. Local news archives yielded another piece of the puzzle. A freelance journalist, David Chen, had died in an apparent suicide 3 days after Elizabeth's death. His laptop, found in his apartment, had been wiped clean. But his handwritten notes, discovered by his family, mentioned a meeting with a whistleblower from Anderson Medical Center planned for the night Elizabeth died. As the evidence mounted, James found himself facing a terrible choice. He could continue helping the investigation, knowing it would lead to his own downfall, or he could use his considerable resources to bury the truth once again. The decision was made for him when Dr. Wright placed a simple piece of paper on his desk, a crayon drawing by Sarah, showing her mother as an angel watching over sick children. The investigation's scope widened beyond Elizabeth's death. Patient advocacy groups began connecting her case to broader patterns of healthcare discrimination. Civil rights attorneys discovered that Anderson Medical Center's policies disproportionately affected minority and low-income patients. What had begun as a hit-and-run investigation was evolving into an examination of systematic healthcare inequality. Marcus Thompson, in a final act of dedication to Elizabeth's memory, organized a candlelight vigil outside Anderson Medical Center. Hundreds attended, including former patients and families of those denied care. Among them was Sarah, still clutching her teddy bear, now understanding that her mother's death was part of a larger story. The truth was emerging, not as a single revelation but as a mosaic of corruption, courage, and consequences. Elizabeth Miller had died not just because of one man's moment of cowardice, but because she dared to challenge a system built on the premise that some lives were worth more than others. Her death had set in motion a reckoning that would force America to confront the true cost of profit-driven healthcare. As the investigation neared its conclusion, Dr. Wright found one last piece of evidence, a recording from Elizabeth's old phone, recovered from hospital storage. In it, Elizabeth's voice spoke with prophetic clarity. "If anything happens to me, remember this: the system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed. The question is, are we willing to live with the design?" The answer to that question would soon shake the foundations of American healthcare. James Anderson's path to redemption began in an unlikely place, the pediatric ward of his flagship hospital. Following the disastrous rejection incident, he began spending his evenings there, watching children receive the care Sarah had been denied. Each beeping monitor and worried parent's face reminded him of how far he had strayed from his original calling as a healer. His first act was both symbolic and practical. He converted his executive suite into a new pediatric care unit. The mahogany panels and leather furniture that had represented his success were replaced with medical equipment and cheerful murals. His personal wine collection was sold, the proceeds dedicated to a new charitable care fund named in Elizabeth Miller's honor. The hospital board reacted with predictable outrage. Emergency meetings were called, threats of shareholder lawsuits were made, and demands for his resignation began circulating. But James weathered these storms with a newfound resolve, responding to each challenge by exposing the human cost of their profit-driven policies. For every financial argument, he presented a case like Sarah's children denied care in the name of fiscal responsibility. He began personally reviewing every case his hospitals had rejected in the past year. The numbers were staggering: thousands of patients turned away, hundreds of lives potentially lost due to delayed or denied care. Each file represented a person, not just a statistic, and James forced himself to read every detail to understand the full weight of his decisions. Working with Dr. Wright, he implemented immediate changes. Emergency care would be provided regardless of insurance status. Payment plans would be offered based on ability to pay. The hospital's legal team was redirected from defending denial of care decisions to helping patients navigate insurance appeals. These changes hemorrhaged money, but James no longer cared about the financial cost. His personal transformation became public when he testified before the state medical board, acknowledging his role in creating a system that prioritized profits over patients. The business press, which had once lauded him as a healthcare innovator, now labeled him a traitor to corporate interests. His fellow hospital executives distanced themselves, fearing his reformed conscience might be contagious. The true test came when Sarah's surgery date approached. The procedure would cost millions, requiring specialized equipment and expertise. James didn't just arrange for the surgery, he sold his mansion, liquidated his investments, and pledged his entire fortune as collateral against future care costs for uninsured patients. The same ruthless determination that had built his empire was now directed at dismantling its most harmful aspects. His redemption efforts extended beyond the hospital walls. He established a foundation to support healthcare whistleblowers, naming Elizabeth Miller as its honorary first member. The foundation provided legal protection and financial support to medical professionals who exposed unethical practices, ensuring that Elizabeth's death would prevent others from being silenced. Rachel, still struggling with addiction but inspired by James's transformation, was offered a path back to medicine through a rehabilitation program sponsored by the foundation. The program would later expand to help other medical professionals dealing with burnout and substance abuse, acknowledging the human cost of profit-driven healthcare on providers themselves. But redemption came at a steep price. Shareholders initiated legal action seeking to prevent the changes he was implementing. Former allies in hospital administration leaked damaging information about past decisions. The empire he had built began to crumble, but James found that losing everything brought an unexpected sense of freedom. The most meaningful moment came when he visited Elizabeth's grave for the first time. He brought no flowers, no grand gestures, only the amended hospital policy documents that would ensure no other patient would be denied care as Sarah had been. Standing there, he finally understood that true redemption wasn't about easing his guilt, but about honoring the principles Elizabeth had died protecting. His final act of redemption was perhaps his most difficult. He began recording a detailed confession about the night of Elizabeth's death. The document named names, admitted guilt, and exposed the entire system of cover-ups and corruption. He placed this confession in trust, to be released if anything happened to Sarah or if the hospital board succeeded in reversing his reforms. James knew his redemption would never be complete. Some debts could never be fully repaid. But as he watched Sarah recover from her surgery, her health improving under the care his hospital could now provide to all children, he understood that redemption wasn't about achieving forgiveness. It was about ensuring that the next Elizabeth Miller wouldn't have to die fighting for what should have been freely given. As winter deepened in Chicago, Sarah's health declined precipitously. Each breath became a battle, her lips taking on a permanent bluish tinge that no amount of warmth could chase away. Dr. Wright monitored her condition daily, watching helplessly as the little girl's strength ebbed while the hospital's bureaucracy slowly processed her case. The symptoms manifested in cruel ways. At school, Sarah could no longer join her classmates at recess, instead watching from the classroom window as they played in the snow. Her beloved teddy bear became not just a comfort object, but a necessity, something to clutch during the increasingly frequent episodes when her heart would race uncontrollably, leaving her gasping and frightened. Rachel, despite her own struggles, recognized the severity of the situation. In moments of clarity between withdrawal symptoms, her medical training would surface, and she'd obsessively monitor Sarah's oxygen levels with a borrowed pulse oximeter. These readings told a frightening story. Sarah's heart was failing faster than anyone had anticipated. The school nurse's office became Sarah's second home. M.S. Thompson, her kindergarten teacher, started keeping a wheelchair in the classroom after Sarah collapsed during morning circle time. The other children, with the innocent wisdom of 5-year-olds, took turns pushing her around the school, turning her disability into a game that made her feel less different. Dr. Wright's medical notes painted a grim picture. Patient shows increasing signs of right heart failure, peripheral edema noted, exercise tolerance declining, immediate surgical intervention recommended. But these clinical observations couldn't capture the reality of watching a child's world shrink day by day, confined by a failing heart. The nights were worst. Sarah would wake gasping, her small body fighting for every breath. Rachel, in her more lucid moments, would sit beside her bed, singing the lullabies Elizabeth used to sing, her voice cracking with grief and guilt. During these dark hours, Sarah would often talk to her mother's photo, asking if heaven had good doctors who could fix broken hearts. Emergency room visits became routine. The staff at Anderson Medical Center grew to know Sarah by name, their professional detachment crumbling in the face of her unfailing politeness and quiet bravery. Even as she struggled to breathe, she would thank them for helping her, apologizing for being such trouble, words that broke the hearts of even the most seasoned medical professionals. The hospital's social workers documented the toll on both child and aunt. Rachel's addiction worsened with each of Sarah's health crises, the stress pushing her deeper into substance abuse. There were nights when neighbors had to call ambulances because Rachel was too intoxicated to respond to Sarah's breathing difficulties. The system was failing not just one life, but two. Christmas decorations still hung in Sarah's hospital room from her last admission, now gathering dust as January crept toward February. She spent her 6th birthday in that room celebrating with hospital staff because Rachel was in detox again. The cake remained largely uneaten. Sarah's heart condition made even this simple pleasure difficult, her appetite diminished by medication and fatigue. Dr. Wright began sleeping in her office, afraid to be far from her young patient. The private notes in her journal revealed her growing despair watching S. decline while waiting for bureaucratic approval feels like witnessing a slow-motion crime. Her mother died fighting this system, and now the same system is killing her daughter. Sarah's art therapy sessions told their own story of decline. Her drawings, once full of color and movement, became increasingly monochromatic and still. She drew herself smaller and smaller, always connected to tubes and machines, while the figure of her mother grew larger, watching from above with angel wings and a sad smile. The breaking point came during a routine checkup that was anything but routine. Sarah, usually stoic beyond her years, suddenly burst into tears. "I'm sorry," she sobbed, clutching her teddy bear. "Mummy said to be brave, but I'm so tired. My heart hurts all the time now." The recording of this moment, captured by hospital security cameras, would later be played during congressional hearings on healthcare reform. James Anderson, watching Sarah's decline through hospital reports and security feeds, saw his life's work through new eyes. Each policy delay, each insurance verification, each administrative hurdle now had the face of a little girl whose time was running out while the system he'd built proceeded at its own methodical pace. The final straw was finding Sarah in the hospital chapel one evening, kneeling despite her weakness, her teddy bear beside her on the pew. Her prayer, caught by the chapel's audio system, was simple: "Dear God, if you can't fix my heart, can you at least help me be strong like Mummy until I see her again?" That night, James Anderson made the decision that would either save Sarah's life or destroy his empire. Either way, he knew he could no longer wait for the system to right itself. The time for redemption was running out, measured in the faltering beats of a child's heart. Copyright. The truth emerged on Christmas Eve, exactly 1 year after Sarah first sat in St. Michael's Church waiting for her mother. The hospital chapel, decorated for the holiday, had become her sanctuary during her extended stay. That evening, as snow fell outside the windows, Sarah overheard a conversation that would shatter her world. James Anderson had chosen the chapel for what he thought would be a private confession to Dr. Wright. He didn't notice the small figure behind the last pew, where Sarah had gone to talk to her mother's spirit, as she often did. "I killed her." Caroline, his voice broke through the chapel's silence. "I was the one driving the car that night. I killed Elizabeth Miller." Sarah remained perfectly still, her teddy bear pressed against her mouth to stifle her gasp. Through her hiding place, she watched the scene unfold like a terrible play. James Anderson, the man who had been visiting her daily, bringing gifts and promises of help, was the reason she'd spent the last year waiting in churches for a mother who would never return. "I was drunk," his confession continued, unaware of his young audience. "It was the anniversary of Catherine's death. I saw Elizabeth crossing the street. I stopped for 17 seconds. 17 seconds where I could have helped her, could have called an ambulance. Instead, I drove away and left her there in the rain." Dr. Wright's response was lost in the sudden roaring in Sarah's ears. Her small world, already confined by her failing heart, collapsed entirely. The teddy bear, her last gift from her mother, slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a soft thud that somehow echoed like thunder in the quiet chapel. Both adults turned at the sound. The look on Sarah's face, a mixture of horror, betrayal, and something far too old for her 6 years, would haunt James Anderson for the rest of his life. She didn't cry, didn't scream. She simply stood there, swaying slightly, her blue-tinged lips forming silent words. Sarah James stepped toward her, but she backed away until she hit the chapel wall. Her breathing, already compromised by her condition, became rapid and shallow. Dr. Wright moved quickly, her doctor's instincts taking over as she recognized the signs of an impending crisis. "You killed my mummy." Sarah's voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper. She was coming home to me, and you killed her. The simple clarity of a child's accusation cut through all of James's carefully constructed justifications. There was no corporate policy to hide behind, no legal terminology to soften the truth. In that moment, Sarah's heart, already weakened by disease, began to race dangerously. The monitors she was connected to started alarming, their urgent beeping a counterpoint to her gasping breaths. But even as Dr. Wright called for emergency assistance, Sarah continued speaking, each word a judgment. "Mummy said bad people get punished," she managed between breaths. "But you got to stay in your big office while she had to go to heaven." The theological simplicity of her worldview made the accusation even more devastating. "Did you say sorry? Did you tell God you were sorry for killing my mummy?" Medical staff rushed into the chapel, responding to Dr. Wright's call. They found Sarah in the midst of a severe cardiac episode, her oxygen levels plummeting. As they lifted her onto a gurney, she locked eyes with James one final time. "Mummy said liars go to hell," she whispered. "Are you going to hell for lying about killing her?" The chapel's security cameras captured the entire scene. The footage would later become crucial evidence, but its immediate impact was far more personal. The sight of Sarah being rushed away, her small body overwhelmed by medical equipment, while still trying to understand why the man who promised to help her was the same man who had destroyed her world, broke something in James Anderson that could never be repaired. Later that night, as Sarah lay sedated in intensive care, James returned to the chapel. He picked up the fallen teddy bear, noting the years of wear, the carefully mended seams, the patches of fur worn smooth by a child's constant tears. This simple toy had witnessed both the loss of its owner's mother and the revelation of her killer. He placed the bear on the altar, beneath the same cross that had watched over his crime's confession. In the empty chapel, James Anderson finally did what he should have done on that rainy night 6 months ago. He knelt and prayed, not for forgiveness he didn't deserve, but for the strength to face the consequences of his actions. Outside the chapel windows, Christmas lights twinkled through the falling snow, celebrating a season of joy and renewal. But inside, a different kind of revelation had taken place, one that would force both the innocent and the guilty to confront truths too heavy for either to bear alone. Rachel Miller's final act unfolded like a Greek tragedy, precisely timed to maximize its devastating impact. On Christmas morning, hours after Sarah's discovery of the truth, hospital staff found Rachel in the chapel, slumped before the altar. Beside her lay a confession written in unsteady handwriting, along with a fatal dose of prescription medication she'd hoarded during her last rehab attempt. The letter, addressed to Sarah but meant for the world to read, revealed layers of guilt and complicity that went far beyond James Anderson's role in Elizabeth's death. Rachel had known parts of the truth all along, her addiction fueled not just by grief but by the weight of her own silence. "My dearest Sarah," the letter began, "I was supposed to meet your mother the night she died. She had discovered something terrible at the hospital, evidence that would have exposed years of deliberate patient neglect, but I was too afraid to help her. I chose my career, my reputation, over doing what was right. When they found her body, I knew it wasn't just an accident. I knew, and I stayed silent." Rachel's confession detailed years of systematic healthcare abuse she had witnessed as a pediatrician at Anderson Medical Center. She had documented cases of children denied care, of families bankrupted by medical bills, of deaths that could have been prevented. Elizabeth had been collecting these stories, building a case against the hospital, and Rachel had been her secret source. The night she died. Rachel wrote, "Elizabeth had finally gathered enough evidence to go public. She called me, excited about meeting with a journalist. She said it would change everything. I promised to meet her, to finally stand up with her. Instead, I took pills and passed out. My cowardice left her walking alone that night, vulnerable to the fate that found her." The letter revealed another shocking truth: Elizabeth's adoption of Sarah hadn't been as random as it appeared. The child had been born to a teenage patient at Anderson Medical Center, a girl denied proper prenatal care due to insurance issues. Elizabeth had been on duty the night the young mother died from preventable complications, making a deathbed promise to care for her baby. "Your mother saw the worst of our healthcare system," Rachel explained, "but she never lost her compassion. She fought for every patient, even when it cost her everything. She took you in because she believed every child deserved a chance, the same chance our hospital denied to so many others." Rachel's professional notebooks, found in her apartment, provided damning evidence of healthcare discrimination spanning decades. She had meticulously documented every case where profit was prioritized over patient care, creating a record that would eventually support major healthcare reform legislation. The most heartbreaking revelation came at the end of her letter. Rachel admitted that she had been awake when Sarah left for the church on that first Christmas Eve. "I heard you leave, sweetheart. I knew where you were going, but I couldn't face the truth of what we'd all lost. Your mother died trying to fix a broken system, and I've spent every day since then trying to numb the guilt of my own complicity." Hospital security cameras captured Dr. Wright finding Rachel's body, the moment of discovery punctuated by Sarah's heart monitor alarms echoing from the ICU. The timing seemed cruelly orchestrated, one more loss for a child who had already lost too much, one more truth revealed too late to change the past. The media descended like vultures, hungry for the story of a whistleblower's death, a killer's confession, and a suicidal doctor's final revelations. But amidst the sensational headlines, the true tragedy was playing out in a hospital room where a little girl, already fighting for her life, had to be sedated to protect her failing heart from one more devastating blow. James Anderson, receiving news of Rachel's death in his office, found himself facing the full weight of his actions. Each death, Elizabeth's, Rachel's, and potentially Sarah's, formed links in a chain of consequences that began with his choice to drive away that rainy night. Rachel's body was discovered clutching a photograph of Elizabeth and Sarah, taken on Sarah's last birthday before the accident. On the back, Rachel had written her final words: "Elizabeth died trying to save others. I die knowing I failed to save her. Sarah, my brave niece, I pray you'll live to create the change your mother died fighting for." The letter and evidence were turned over to authorities, but their immediate impact was more personal than legal. For Sarah, lying in intensive care, the loss of her aunt, however troubled she had been, represented the severing of her last connection to her mother's world. For James Anderson, Rachel's suicide added another layer to his burden of guilt. And for the hospital staff, the revelations in Rachel's notebooks forced them to confront their own role in maintaining a system that had claimed 3 lives, one through violence, one through despair, and one still fighting against time and fate in the pediatric ECU. The truth exploded into public consciousness like a sudden storm, carried by every major news network in the country. The morning after Rachel's death, security footage from the hospital chapel showing both James's confession and Sarah's devastating discovery was leaked to the media. Within hours, the video had gone viral, its raw emotional impact cutting through the usual news cycle cynicism. CNN ran the headline: "Healthcare CEO confesses to nurse's murder, child victim fights for life in his own hospital." The story combined every element of human drama: a hit-and-run death, a corporate cover-up, a dying child, and a suicide that exposed decades of healthcare corruption. Social media erupted with clips of Sarah's quiet accusation, "You killed my mummy." Outside Anderson Medical Center, crowds gathered: former patients, denied care, families of those who had died waiting for treatment, nurses who had been fired for advocating too strongly for their patients. They carried signs with Elizabeth Miller's photo and quotes from Rachel's suicide letter. Some held candlelight vigils, others demanded justice with increasing anger. But the hospital's board of directors called an emergency meeting, but the damage control they attempted only made things worse. Their prepared statement about investigating these allegations was drowned out by Rachel's meticulous records, which painted a damning picture of systematic healthcare discrimination. Each case she documented represented a life valued in dollars rather than humanity. Local news crews discovered Elizabeth's original letter to the medical board, salvaged from the storm drain by Marcus Thompson. Though water damaged, enough was legible to confirm Rachel's claims. Elizabeth had been building a case that showed how the hospital's policies disproportionately affected vulnerable populations, children, minorities, the elderly. Congressional leaders called for immediate hearings. The story had touched a nerve in a nation already deeply divided over healthcare access. Elizabeth Miller became a symbol of the fight for medical equity, her death reframed as martyrdom for a cause that many had fought for but few had died defending. Dr. Wright broke her silence in a powerful television interview. She detailed how Sarah's case had exposed the cruel ironies of the system: a child denied care in the very hospital where her mother had died, trying to protect patient rights. The image of Sarah's blue-tinged lips and struggling breath became a powerful testament to the human cost of profit-driven healthcare. Professional medical organizations began distancing themselves from Anderson Medical Center. Other hospitals rushed to announce policy changes, afraid of facing similar scrutiny. The story had moved beyond one man's guilt or one child's tragedy to expose systemic failures that had been hiding in plain sight. James Anderson's confession, played repeatedly on news channels, forced a national conversation about corporate responsibility in healthcare. His words, "I killed her," Caroline, became a metaphor for the entire system's culpability. Each replay of Sarah's discovery in the chapel drove home the personal cost of treating healthcare as a privilege rather than a right. Investigative journalists began connecting dots that Rachel's death had exposed. They found patterns of similar cases across the country: whistleblowers silenced, patients denied care, deaths that could have been prevented. Elizabeth's fight, it turned out, had been just one battle in a larger war over American healthcare. Social media amplified the story's reach. Justice for Elizabeth trended alongside Sarah. The public watched in real time as Sarah's condition deteriorated, her story becoming intertwined with her mother's in ways that transcended the original tragedy. Each medical update became breaking news, each setback another indictment of the system. Former hospital employees came forward with their own stories. A pattern emerged of retaliation against staff who questioned policies, of bonuses tied to care denial rates, of a corporate culture that had lost sight of medicine's fundamental purpose. Elizabeth's personnel file, leaked online, showed years of exemplary service until she began documenting these practices. The most damaging revelation came from an unexpected source. Catherine Anderson's old journals, found in James's mansion, revealed that she had been investigating similar issues before her death. The parallels between her fatal hit and run and Elizabeth's were too striking to ignore, suggesting a deeper conspiracy that had claimed multiple lives. As public pressure mounted, state and federal investigations were launched. The FDA began reviewing death rates at Anderson facilities. Insurance regulators examined denial patterns. The FBI opened investigations into possible criminal negligence. The empire James Anderson had built was crumbling, but the exposure of its foundations served a greater purpose. Through it all, Sarah remained in intensive care, her condition a daily reminder of what the fight was really about. Her story had become a catalyst for change, but for those watching her struggle to breathe, no system reform could come quickly enough to undo the damage already done to one small girl who just wanted her mother back. The Chicago community fractured like ice in spring over the revelations at Anderson Medical Center. Lines were drawn not just between social classes, but through families, neighborhoods, and workplaces. The hospital, long a symbol of medical excellence for the wealthy, became a battleground where America's healthcare debate played out in microcosm. On one side stood the hospital's defenders, employees afraid of losing their jobs, investors watching their portfolios plummet, and patients from privileged backgrounds who had only known the facility's premium care. They argued that James Anderson's personal crimes shouldn't destroy an institution that, despite its flaws, provided world-class medical care to thousands. Opposing them were the families of those denied care, former employees fired for advocating too strongly for patients, and a growing movement of healthcare reform activists. They carried photos of Elizabeth Miller and Sarah, turning mother and daughter into unwitting symbols of their cause. Each evening, candlelight vigils outside the hospital grew larger, their circles of light surrounding the building like a conscience made visible. The city's religious communities became unexpectedly divided. Some churches, including St. Michael's, where Sarah had waited that fateful Christmas Eve, opened their doors as meeting places for healthcare reform activists. Others, particularly those with wealthy donors connected to the hospital, preached forgiveness and cautioned against hasty judgment. Medical professionals across Chicago found themselves forced to take sides. Some resigned from Anderson Medical Center in protest, while others defended the hospital's practices as unfortunate but necessary in America's healthcare system. Emergency room doctors from competing hospitals began offering free consultations in church basements and community centers, creating an underground network of care that echoed Elizabeth's own rebellious practices. The media attention brought celebrities and politicians to Chicago, each trying to capitalize on the story's emotional resonance. They made speeches outside the hospital, promising reforms and demanding justice, but few ventured inside to see the human cost of the system they had helped create. Sarah's room became a kind of sacred space, off limits to cameras and campaigners, protected fiercely by hospital staff who had grown to love her. Local businesses near the hospital faced their own dilemmas. Some posted justice for Elizabeth signs in their windows, while others continued serving the hospital staff and wealthy patients who had been their bread and butter for years. The owner of a small coffee shop across from the hospital entrance found himself in tears one morning, torn between his principles and the reality that half his customers worked in the building his window signs now condemned. The city schools became another battlefield. Children whose parents worked at the hospital faced bullying, while teachers struggled to explain why some of their students' parents were protesting outside the place where Sarah fought for her life. In Sarah's own school, her empty desk became a kind of shrine, covered with get-well cards and drawings from classmates too young to understand the politics but old enough to grasp the injustice. Former patients of Rachel's came forward with stories of her compassion before addiction claimed her career. They described a doctor who would spend hours with frightened children, who kept a drawer full of small toys in her office, who sometimes paid for medications herself when insurance denied coverage. Their testimonies complicated the narrative, adding layers of tragedy to what might have been a simpler story of right and wrong. The homeless community around St. Michael's Church, who had known Elizabeth from her volunteer work, organized their own form of protest. Led by Marcus Thompson, they began telling their stories to anyone who would listen, tales of being turned away from Anderson Medical Center, of watching friends die from treatable conditions, of the small kindnesses Elizabeth had shown them when no one else would. City council meetings became battlegrounds where healthcare policy was debated with unprecedented passion. Long-serving politicians found themselves confronted by constituents demanding to know their ties to Anderson Medical Center. Campaign contribution records were scrutinized, revealing a web of financial relationships between the hospital and local government. Through it all, Dr. Wright and her medical team tried to maintain a sphere of normalcy around Sarah, shielding her from the storm her story had unleashed. But the division in the community affected even her treatment, as some specialists refused to consult on her case, fearing association with the hospital's scandal, while others volunteered their services pro bono, seeing a chance to be on the right side of history. The community's fractures revealed deeper truths about American healthcare, how access to treatment had become a marker of social class, how profit motives had corrupted medical decision-making, how a single hospital could be simultaneously a temple of healing for some and a symbol of exclusion for others. As winter deepened in Chicago, these divisions only grew sharper, like shadows lengthening in the late afternoon sun. James Anderson's public confession came on a bitterly cold January morning, exactly 1 year after Elizabeth Miller's death. He chose to make his statement in the hospital chapel, the same place where Sarah had discovered the truth. Local news cameras broadcast live as he stepped up to the makeshift podium, his expensive suit replaced by a simple grey sweater that made him look suddenly old and vulnerable. "I am the man who killed Elizabeth Miller," he began, his voice steady despite his trembling hands. "I left her to die in the rain outside this hospital, a hospital that had already betrayed her through policies I created and enforced. Today I take responsibility not just for her death, but for the system of negligence that led to it." As he spoke, police officers waited discreetly in the back of the chapel. The district attorney had agreed to this final public statement before taking him into custody, recognizing the symbolic importance of the moment. James had negotiated one condition for his surrender: that all charges would include not just Elizabeth's death, but the systematic healthcare violations that had been his true crime. His confession was comprehensive and devastating. He detailed the 17 seconds he sat in his car after hitting Elizabeth, the calls he made to cover up the crime, the evidence he had destroyed. But he went further, exposing every policy he had implemented that prioritized profit over patient care, every decision that had valued money over life. "Elizabeth Miller died twice," he declared, his voice breaking for the first time. "First, when I fired her for saving a life without proper authorization. Then, when my car struck her as she left carrying evidence that could have exposed our crimes. Her death was not a moment of weakness, it was the inevitable result of a system I spent years building." The most powerful moment came when he addressed Sarah directly, though she remained in intensive care, too ill to attend. Looking directly into the cameras, he spoke to the child whose life he had shattered. "Sarah, no apology can restore what I took from you. But I promise that your mother's death will not be meaningless. The truth she died protecting will finally be heard." As he spoke, federal agents were executing search warrants throughout the hospital network, seizing records and computers. The investigation had expanded far beyond a single hit and run, encompassing decades of healthcare fraud and discrimination. James had provided evidence against himself and his entire organization, ensuring that his confession would bring down more than just one man. He revealed the full scope of the cover-up surrounding Elizabeth's death, the security footage he had ordered destroyed, the witnesses who had been silenced, the investigators who had been paid to look the other way. Each revelation implicated not just himself but an entire system of power and privilege that had protected him. When he finished speaking, he did something unprecedented. He removed his hospital ID badge and placed it on the altar alongside Sarah's teddy bear, which had remained there since the night of his first confession. The symbolic gesture, captured by dozens of cameras, would become a defining image of the scandal. The police moved forward then, reading him his rights in front of the assembled media. James offered no resistance as they handcuffed him, maintaining his dignity even as flashbulbs captured his final moments of freedom. His last words before being led away were directed at his board of directors: "The time for profit over people is over." Doc. Wright, watching from the chapel doorway, later described the scene in her memoir. "We witnessed not just the arrest of a man, but the beginning of the end of a healthcare system built on inequality," as they led him away. "I remembered something Elizabeth once said, that sometimes healing requires surgery to cut out what has become diseased." The charges against James Anderson were extensive vehicular homicide, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud, and numerous violations of federal healthcare regulations. He had instructed his lawyers not to fight the charges but to use each court appearance as an opportunity to expose more of the system's failures. His bail was set at $50 million, money he could have easily provided before he had liquidated his fortune to fund Sarah's care and healthcare reform initiatives. Instead, he chose to remain in custody, converting his cell into an office from which he continued to provide evidence against the healthcare empire he had built. As he was led away from the chapel in handcuffs, someone in the crowd began to sing Amazing Grace, the same hymn that had been playing when he first met Sarah on Christmas night. The song spread through the assembled crowd, following him out into the winter morning, a reminder that even in moments of justice, grace could still be found. In the days following James's arrest, Sarah's condition deteriorated rapidly. The emotional trauma of discovering the truth about her mother's death, combined with Rachel's suicide and the constant media attention, had taken its toll on her already weakened heart. Dr. Wright moved her bed to a secure wing of the pediatric ICU, creating a sanctuary away from the chaos engulfing the hospital. The monitors told a story of a tiny body fighting against overwhelming odds. Sarah's oxygen saturation levels dropped dangerously low, requiring increased ventilation support. Her heart, struggling to maintain its rhythm, triggered alarms with increasing frequency. The medical staff worked in shifts, never leaving her side, their professional detachment crumbling in the face of her quiet courage. "I'm tired of being brave," she whispered one night, clutching her teddy bear during a particularly difficult episode. The words, captured by her bedside nurse in medical notes, became a rallying cry for healthcare reformers. Here was a child who had been forced to be brave not just against illness, but against a system that had failed her at every turn. Dr. Wright's journal entries from this period revealed the medical team's growing desperation. "Her heart is giving out," she wrote, "not just from the congenital defect, but from carrying burdens no child should bear. She's fighting not just disease, but the weight of too many losses, too many betrayals." The hospital staff, divided over James's arrest and the ongoing investigations, united in their care for Sarah. Nurses worked extra shifts without pay, specialists offered consultations pro bono, and even administrative staff found ways to expedite the paperwork that had once delayed her treatment. The same system that had once denied her care now moved heaven and earth to save her. Sarah's classroom sent daily video messages, her classmates singing songs and sharing stories to lift her spirits. Her teacher, Ms. Thompson, spent her evenings reading stories at Sarah's bedside, trying to create moments of normalcy in an increasingly critical situation. The teddy bear, now worn almost bare in places, remained her constant companion, a last link to her mother's love. The crisis point came during a stormy night in February. Sarah's heart began failing dramatically, its rhythm becoming increasingly erratic. Dr. Wright initiated emergency protocols, the team working desperately to stabilize her condition. In a moment of lucidity between crisis interventions, Sarah looked up at the doctor and asked, "Is this how Mummy felt when she was alone in the rain?" But that question, posed with a child's devastating directness, brought the veteran physician to tears. The medical team redoubled their efforts, refusing to let Elizabeth Miller's daughter suffer the same fate as her mother. They worked through the night, employing every technique and treatment available, their determination fueled by the need to break the cycle of loss. From his jail cell, James Anderson followed Sarah's condition through updates from Dr. Wright. Upon learning of her crisis, he signed papers authorizing the use of his entire fortune for her care, with a note attached: "Save her, no matter the cost. Let one life at least be worth more than money." The media gathered outside the hospital, reporting hourly updates on Sarah's condition. The public, which had followed her story from the beginning, held candlelight vigils across the country. Prayer groups formed spontaneously in hospital lobbies nationwide, all focused on one small girl fighting for her life in Chicago. Inside Sarah's room, the battle continued. Her small body, connected to machines that dwarfed her, fought with diminishing strength. The teddy bear remained tucked under her arm, its worn fabric dampened by the tears of nurses who had grown to love the brave little girl in their care. Dr. Wright maintained her vigil, monitoring every change, adjusting treatments, refusing to accept defeat. Elizabeth died alone in the dark, she told her team during one critical moment. "We will not let her daughter follow, not while we have the power to fight." As February turned to March, Sarah's condition remained precarious. Each day brought new challenges, new crises to overcome. But something had changed in the hospital's response to her care. The same institution that had once turned her away now demonstrated what healthcare could be when profit motives were removed from the equation, a system of healing, of hope, of humanity. The question that hung over her bed, unspoken but ever present, was whether this transformation had come too late for one small girl whose only crime had been to inherit her mother's fighting spirit and her broken heart. The discovery of Elizabeth Miller's diary came unexpectedly, hidden in a place so obvious it had been overlooked. Marcus Thompson, continuing his quiet investigation, found it tucked inside the church's ancient hymnal, the very book Elizabeth and Sarah had used during their Sunday services. The small, leather-bound journal, its pages warped from the night rain, had soaked through her bag, contained revelations that would reshape everything known about the case. Elizabeth's final entries painted a picture far more complex than anyone had imagined. She had been investigating not just patient care violations, but a systematic conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Chicago's medical establishment. The entries detailed meetings with other whistleblowers, secret recordings of board meetings, and a careful documentation of cases where patients had died after being denied care. "Today I watched another child die," one entry read. "He could have been saved with a simple procedure, but his parents' insurance was denied. I keep thinking of Sarah, how it could have been her. Every child I can't save feels like failing my own daughter. This has to stop, no matter the cost." The most shocking revelation came in her last entry, dated the day of her death. Elizabeth had discovered a connection between Catherine Anderson's fatal accident and the hospital's darkest secrets. Catherine, it seemed, had also been gathering evidence of healthcare violations before her death. The entry suggested that her hit and run had not been random, but a deliberate attempt to silence her. But Catherine Anderson was building the same case I am now, Elizabeth wrote. Her death was called an accident, just like they'll probably call mine if they catch me, but I have proof that James Anderson's entire empire is built on deliberate negligence and covered-up deaths. Tonight, I meet with the journalist. If anything happens to me, the evidence is hidden where only Sarah would think to look. The diary revealed Elizabeth's methodical preparation for the worst. She had created a trust fund for Sarah, hidden in an account under her maiden name. She had documented every threat, every warning, every attempt to silence her. Most importantly, she had left a trail of evidence that she knew would eventually be found. One passage, written just weeks before her death, was particularly haunting. Sarah asked me today why some people can't go to doctors when they're sick. How do you explain to a child that in our world? Money matters more than life? I told her that sometimes angels have to fight very hard to change things. I pray she'll understand someday why her mother had to be one of those angels. The diary also contained personal moments that brought Elizabeth's sacrifice into sharp focus. She wrote about Sarah's heart condition, her desperate attempts to get her daughter proper medical care, and her growing realization that the system she was fighting might cost both their lives. "I can't stay silent," she wrote. "Not when Sarah's future depends on changing this system." Dr. Wright, reading the diary in Sarah's hospital room, discovered entries about her own role in the story. Elizabeth had noted every time Wright had tried to help patients despite hospital policy, marking her as a potential ally. "There are still good people within these walls," she wrote. "They remember what healing really means." The final pages contained a letter to Sarah, to be read when she was older. "My dearest angel. It began, if you're reading this, then I died trying to make the world better for children like you. Don't hate them for taking me away. Use your heart, your beautiful, struggling heart, to continue the fight. Sometimes love means risking everything to protect others." James Anderson, presented with the diary in his jail cell, read it cover to cover in one sitting. Elizabeth's descriptions of his transformation from healer to businessman, seen through the eyes of someone fighting against his policies, forced him to confront the full scope of his moral decay. Her final entry about him was devastating in its simplicity. He was a doctor once. He must remember somewhere in his soul what that meant. Marcus Thompson helped the FBI locate the additional evidence Elizabeth had mentioned. Hidden throughout the church were documents, recordings, and files, a complete record of systematic healthcare discrimination that she had methodically gathered. Each piece had been carefully placed where only someone who knew her story would think to look. The diary's discovery transformed the narrative from a simple hit-and-run cover-up to something far more sinister. Elizabeth Miller had not been just another victim of corporate negligence, she had been a warrior in a battle that had claimed multiple lives. Her written words, preserved despite attempts to silence them, would finally accomplish what she had died trying to achieve, exposing a system that valued profit over human life. The full surveillance footage surfaced like a ghost from the hospital's digital archives, discovered by an IT technician during the federal investigation. Unlike the edited versions used to cover up Elizabeth's death, these files showed the complete sequence of events from every angle. The raw footage, spanning multiple cameras and timestamps, told a story far more damning than even James Anderson's confession had revealed. The primary footage showed Elizabeth leaving the hospital at 11:42 p.m., clutching her messenger bag close against the rain. She paused briefly under the entrance awning, making a final phone call later confirmed to be to Rachel. Additional cameras caught her walking purposefully toward the journalist's office, unaware of the Mercedes that had been idling in the executive parking area. The most crucial revelation came from camera 23, positioned high above the impact site. It captured not just the collision, but the agonizing 17 seconds afterward when James Anderson's car stopped. The enhanced audio picked up Elizabeth's voice, still conscious, calling for help. The footage showed James's door opening slightly before closing again, his decision to flee captured in terrible clarity. But the surveillance footage revealed something even more shocking. Within minutes of the incident, hospital security teams appeared, following precise protocols that suggested this wasn't their first cover-up. They methodically collected evidence, redirected other cameras, and cleaned the scene before emergency services arrived. The timestamp showed Elizabeth lying injured for 43 minutes before an ambulance was called. The most heartbreaking sequence came from the emergency room cameras. They showed Elizabeth, still conscious upon arrival, trying to tell the staff something. Her words, caught by hospital microphones, were clear: Sarah. Tell Sarah. Evidence in the church. The attending physician, more focused on following admission protocols than listening to a dying woman, missed what would turn out to be crucial information. Camera footage from the following days showed hospital administrators orchestrating the cover-up. Meetings in boardrooms, documents being shredded, security footage being edited, all captured and preserved despite attempts to erase them. The system's automated backups had maintained perfect records of its own corruption. The most damning clips showed the hospital board meeting the morning after Elizabeth's death. They discussed not the loss of life or the need for investigation, but rather the potential financial impact and strategies for maintaining their profit margins. One board member was recorded saying, "Let's make sure this doesn't impact our quarterly numbers." Its specialists recovered deleted footage showing Catherine Anderson's similar accident years earlier. The patterns were identical: immediate security response, evidence removal, delayed emergency services. The footage confirmed Elizabeth's diary entries about a systematic approach to silencing whistleblowers. When compiled chronologically, the footage created a documentary of corporate callousness. Every decision, every cover-up, every moment of choosing profit over human life was preserved in high-definition detail. The timestamps couldn't be disputed, the faces were clear, the actions undeniable. Dr. Wright, reviewing the footage with federal investigators, identified dozens of staff members who had participated in the cover-up, many of whom still worked at the hospital. The videos showed them following established protocols for managing incidents, suggesting that Elizabeth's death was not an isolated event but part of a larger pattern. The final piece of footage, from the chapel security camera the night Sarah discovered the truth, captured something unexpected. After everyone had left, James Anderson could be seen kneeling at the altar, his shoulders shaking with sobs. This unguarded moment of remorse, caught by accident, would later be used in his sentencing hearing as evidence of genuine repentance. When the footage was eventually released to the public, its impact was seismic. The methodical documentation of institutional corruption, the clear evidence of multiple cover-ups, and the human cost of corporate healthcare policies could no longer be denied. The videos became powerful tools for healthcare reform advocates, each frame a testament to the need for systemic change. The surveillance footage, meant to protect the hospital's interests, had instead preserved its crimes. Every camera, every microphone, every digital record had become a witness to the truth Elizabeth Miller died trying to expose. In death, she had achieved what she couldn't in life, forcing the world to see the real cost of treating healthcare as a business rather than a human right. The final revelation emerged from Elizabeth's diary and hospital records, piecing together a story that connected every thread of the tragedy. Sarah's true origins, carefully hidden by Elizabeth, traced back to Anderson Medical Center 5 years earlier, to a young woman named Hannah Martinez, who had been denied prenatal care due to lack of insurance. Hannah had been 19, working 3 jobs to support herself through community college when she became pregnant. The pregnancy was high risk, requiring specialized care that Anderson Medical Center repeatedly denied. Elizabeth, then a newly hired nurse, had fought to get Hannah admitted, even offering to pay for her care personally, but hospital policies remained inflexible. The diary entries from that period revealed Elizabeth's growing desperation. "Hannah reminds me of myself at her age," she wrote. "Today she told me she's named the baby Sarah, after her grandmother. She made me promise to watch over her child if anything happened. I agreed, never thinking I'd have to keep that promise so soon." Hannah died in childbirth on a rainy night, much like the one that would later claim Elizabeth's life. The official cause was listed as complications, but Elizabeth's private notes told a different story. Every warning sign had been ignored, every request for specialist intervention denied. The baby Sarah survived only because Elizabeth defied protocols to provide emergency care. The most shocking connection came through another diary entry. Catherine Anderson had been the social worker assigned to Hannah's case. She had been building a file on the hospital's treatment of uninsured mothers, using Hannah's case as a prime example. This investigation would later inspire Elizabeth's broader examination of the hospital's practices, creating a tragic link between all 3 women. Elizabeth's decision to adopt Sarah hadn't been the random act of kindness everyone assumed. She had made a deathbed promise to Hannah, one that she kept even as it drew her deeper into investigating the hospital's practices. "Every time I look at Sarah," she wrote, "I see Hannah's eyes, her determination. This child is my treasure, but also my responsibility, a reminder of why this system must change." The truth explained Sarah's heart condition. It had been inherited from Hannah, who had never received the genetic screening that might have identified it early. The same hospital policies that killed her birth mother had continued to deny her the care she needed, creating a cruel cycle of institutional negligence. James Anderson, reading the full report in his cell, learned that he had inadvertently played a role in both mothers' deaths. His policies had denied Hannah care, leading to her death in childbirth, and then his actions had taken Sarah's adoptive mother as well. The weight of this double tragedy added another layer to his burden of guilt. Dr. Wright, who had been a resident during Hannah's case, finally understood why Elizabeth had been so fiercely protective of Sarah's medical records. She had been guarding not just a child's privacy, but a story that exposed the full scope of the hospital's systemic failures. Every denial of care, every policy that prioritized profit over patients, was reflected in Sarah's history. The revelation about Sarah's birth parents sparked another wave of media attention. Hannah Martinez's story, a young woman dying needlessly due to lack of medical care, resonated with millions of Americans facing similar healthcare barriers. Her death and Elizabeth's subsequent adoption of Sarah became powerful symbols of both the system's cruelty and the compassion of those fighting against it. Sarah, when she was well enough to understand, learned that she had been loved by not one, but two mothers who had died fighting the same broken system. Dr. Wright found her one night in her hospital room, holding photos of both Hannah and Elizabeth. "They were both my angels," Sarah said simply, understanding with the child's clarity what the adults around her had struggled to accept. The truth about Sarah's origins transformed her from a symbol of tragedy to one of hope, a child born of one mother's sacrifice, raised by another's love, and now fighting for her life in the very institution that had failed them both. Her story was no longer just about loss, but about the connections between women who had dared to challenge a system that devalued human life. In her final diary entry, Elizabeth had written words that prove prophetic. Sarah carries within her the strength of two mothers' love. Someday, her story will help change the world we failed to fix. Until then, I pray that love will be enough to protect her from the battles still to come. From his prison cell, James Anderson orchestrated the most radical transformation in American healthcare history. Using his trial as a platform, he not only pleaded guilty to Elizabeth's death, but systematically exposed every flaw in the system he had helped create. His testimony before Congress, delivered via video link while wearing prison orange, became a watershed moment in the fight for healthcare reform. The transformation began with a single act signing over his entire fortune, estimated at $4.2 billion, to establish the Elizabeth Miller Foundation for Healthcare Justice. The foundation's first act was to cover all medical costs for uninsured patients at Anderson Medical Center, effectively turning the hospital into a non-profit institution overnight. The board of directors' attempts to block this move were thwarted by careful legal preparation. James had spent his pre-arrest days ensuring his wealth would serve restitution rather than retain power. His prison cell became an unlikely command center for reform. Working with a team of lawyers and healthcare advocates, he drafted detailed exposés of common insurance denial tactics, profit-driven care restrictions, and corporate schemes to maximize revenue at patients' expense. Each revelation was more damaging than the last, as he systematically dismantled the empire he had spent decades building. During his sentencing hearing, James surprised everyone by requesting the maximum penalty. "I don't seek leniency." He told the judge, "I seek justice not just for Elizabeth Miller, but for every patient my policies harmed. Let my imprisonment serve as a reminder that treating healthcare as a business rather than a human right is itself a crime." The most profound aspect of his transformation was his work with other hospital CEOs. Through letters and monitored phone calls, he began convincing his former peers to adopt radical reforms. His message was simple but powerful: we were healers once, before we became businessmen. It's time to remember our original calling. His written confession, published in the New England Journal of Medicine, sent shockwaves through the medical community. Titled "Profit Over Patients, a CEO's Reckoning," it detailed how corporate healthcare had corrupted the fundamental mission of medicine. The article became required reading in medical schools, sparking debates about the ethics of for-profit healthcare. Perhaps his most meaningful act was establishing a trust for Sarah's care, structured to cover not just her immediate medical needs, but to provide for her education and future. The trust included a provision that she would have control over a significant portion of the foundation's resources upon reaching adulthood, ensuring that Elizabeth's daughter would have the power to continue her mother's fight for healthcare justice. From his cell, James watched news reports of the changes sweeping through his former hospital. The emergency room that had once turned away uninsured patients now treated everyone equally. The billing department that had pursued aggressive collections now worked to help patients navigate financial assistance. The corporate culture of profit maximization was being replaced by one of compassionate care. When asked why he had chosen such a dramatic form of redemption, James spoke of the 17 seconds he sat in his car after hitting Elizabeth. "In those seconds, I chose money over morality, power over compassion. Every day since then has been about making a different choice. My imprisonment is freedom from the prison I built myself, the prison of valuing profit over human life. His transformation became a case study in corporate ethics courses, examining how personal tragedy and guilt could catalyze systemic change. But for James, the metrics of success were simpler each time he received news of Sarah's improving condition. Each report of a life saved by his foundation's work, each letter from a healthcare worker describing positive changes in patient care. In his cell, James kept only 2 photos: Catherine in her social worker days, helping a patient, and Elizabeth Miller's staff ID photo. Between them, he placed a crayon drawing Sarah had sent him a picture of angels watching over a hospital. The drawing reminded him daily that redemption, while it couldn't change the past, could still transform the future. Sarah's recovery defied medical expectations, as if her mother's fighting spirit lived on in every heartbeat. The surgery, funded by James Anderson's foundation, was performed by a team of world-renowned specialists who had volunteered their services after hearing her story. Dr. Wright remained by her side throughout the 12-hour procedure, holding the teddy bear that had witnessed so much of Sarah's journey. The first sign of recovery came 3 days post-surgery when Sarah opened her eyes and asked for her bear. The stuffed animal, now wearing surgical scrubs sewn by the nurses, had acquired a tiny stethoscope and a name badge identifying it as Dr. Bear, Chief of Pediatric Hugs. Sarah's first smile in weeks came at the sight of this whimsical transformation of her constant companion. Dr. Caroline Wright, who had fought so hard to save Sarah's life, made a decision that would change both their lives. After months of serving as Sarah's primary physician and advocate, she began the process of becoming her foster mother. The application cited the unique bond they had formed through Sarah's ordeal and Wright's deep understanding of her medical needs. The adoption proceedings were expedited with support from the same legal system that had failed Elizabeth. Judges and social workers, perhaps seeking to atone for past institutional failures, moved quickly to create a new family. Sarah's response to the news was characteristically profound. Dr. Wright helped fix my heart twice, once with medicine and once with love. Their new home became a place of healing and growth. Dr. Wright converted her home office into a bedroom for Sarah, painting it the same shade of yellow as Elizabeth's kitchen had been. The walls were adorned with photos of both Elizabeth and Hannah, ensuring Sarah would always know the love of both her mothers. A special shelf held her teddy bear and Elizabeth's diary, preserving the connections to her past. The hospital staff who had cared for Sarah remained part of her extended family. Nurses stopped by with books and games, technicians taught her about the medical equipment that had helped save her life, and even the cleaning staff who had kept her room spotless during her stay became regular visitors. The community that had formed around her struggle became a permanent support system. Sarah's recovery included more than physical healing. Dr. Wright arranged for gentle counseling sessions to help her process the losses she had endured. Through art therapy and play, Sarah began to express her feelings about her mother's, her illness, and her new life. Her drawings evolved from scenes of hospitals and angels to pictures of her growing family, Dr. Wright, her teddy bear, and the countless people who had helped save her. The foundation established in Elizabeth's name ensured that Sarah would have every opportunity her mother had dreamed of. A college fund was set up, along with resources for any future medical needs. But perhaps more importantly, the foundation's work meant that other children wouldn't face the same barriers to care that had nearly cost Sarah her life. On the day Sarah was officially adopted, the ceremony was held in St. Michael's Church, where her story had begun on that fateful Christmas Eve. Marcus Thompson, now employed by the Elizabeth Miller Foundation, rang the church bells in celebration. Dr. Wright held Sarah's hand as the judge pronounced them legally mother and daughter, while the teddy bear sat between them wearing a tiny judge's robe made by the hospital's surgical team. Sarah's message to the gathered crowd was simple but powerful. I have 3 mothers now, one in heaven who gave me life, one in heaven who chose me with love, and one here who helped me live. plus a whole hospital full of angels. Her words, spoken with a child's innocent wisdom, captured the essence of how tragedy had transformed into family, how loss had led to love, and how one child's story had helped change a broken system. On a crisp autumn morning in 2039, Sarah Wright Miller stood at the podium of Anderson Medical Center's newly renovated auditorium, addressing the incoming class of medical residents. At 21, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who understood both healing and hurt. Her mother's diary lay open on the podium, its pages worn but precious, while her faithful teddy bear, now retired to a place of honor in her office, watched from its shelf. The hospital had transformed beyond recognition. The Elizabeth Miller Memorial Wing provided care to all children regardless of their ability to pay. The Hannah Martinez Maternal Care Center ensured that no expectant mother would ever be turned away. James Anderson, now in the final year of his sentence, had watched via video link as his former empire became a model for healthcare reform nationwide. Sarah's speech to the new doctors drew from all three of her mother's legacies. From Hannah, she inherited the fierce determination to survive against odds. From Elizabeth, she gained the courage to fight for what was right. From Caroline Wright, who sat proudly in the front row, she learned how to turn compassion into action. The Elizabeth Miller Foundation, now under Sarah's leadership, had expanded its mission beyond Chicago. It operated clinics in underserved communities, funded medical research focused on neglected diseases, and provided legal support to healthcare whistleblowers. The foundation's board included Marcus Thompson, whose journey from homeless patient to healthcare advocate embodied the change they sought to create. Dr. Caroline Wright continued her work as Chief of Pediatrics, her office still displaying the crayon drawings Sarah had made during her recovery. Mother and daughter worked together, their shared experience informing their approach to patient care. But they had developed a protocol for treating uninsured patients that had been adopted by hospitals nationwide. James Anderson, though still imprisoned, had become an unlikely champion of healthcare reform. His prison writings on medical ethics were required reading in medical schools. Upon learning of his impending release, Sarah had shocked many by offering him a position as an advisor to the foundation, believing that redemption should include the opportunity to repair what had been broken. The teddy bear in Sarah's office wore an honorary medical degree, awarded by her graduating class at medical school. Its worn fur and missing button eye had witnessed her journey from a dying child to a doctor determined to change the system that had nearly killed her. Each new medical student heard the story of Dr. Bear and the little girl who survived to reform American healthcare. St. Michael's Church still held special Christmas Eve services in memory of Elizabeth Miller, though they had evolved into celebrations of hope rather than memorials of loss. The congregation included many of the healthcare workers who had cared for Sarah, their own children now grown, the story of the little girl in the church becoming part of their family histories. Sarah's own medical practice focused on children with heart conditions, ensuring that no family would face alone the challenges she had endured. Her patients received not just medical care but comprehensive support, their teddy bears given honorary medical credentials, their fears met with understanding from someone who had walked their path. On her office wall hung 3 portraits: Hannah Martinez, smiling in her college photo, Elizabeth Miller in her nurse's uniform, and Caroline Wright on the day of Sarah's adoption. Below them sat the worn diary that had exposed the truth, the hospital ID badge James had left on the altar, and a child's drawing of angels watching over a hospital. As Sarah concluded her speech to the new residents, she held up her mother's diary. "Healthcare isn't about profits or policy," she told them. "It's about people. My mothers, all 3 of them, died or fought so that you could stand here today, ready to become healers rather than business people. Never forget that every patient has a story, every policy has a human cost, and every one of you has the power to choose justice over profit." Dear viewers, I hope this story has touched your hearts and made you reflect on the state of healthcare and human compassion in our society. What moved you the most? Was it Sarah's incredible strength, Elizabeth's sacrifice, James's redemption, or Dr. Wright's unwavering dedication? Perhaps it was the powerful message about how one person's courage can transform an entire system. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this emotional journey. What moments resonated with you personally? How do you think this story reflects the real-world challenges in healthcare? What would you have done in the characters' positions? Please share your perspectives in the comments below. Your insights and experiences can help us understand the impact of this story and the important issues it raises. Thank you for watching and being part of this meaningful conversation.